Hi, and welcome to Chapter 15 in our text. Lotus Vaughn's doing ethics. This chapter is on war, specifically on the moral justification for war. So I want to spend a few minutes with you talking about the concept of just war theory. Just war theory is divided into three components, and each component has a separate set of criteria that must be met in order for the war to be considered just. So let's look at the first component first. It's jus ad bellum, and that is the right to wage war. So the first criteria that must be met is that the cause or reason for going to war must be just. So going to war cannot be justified by an attempt to reclaim territory or to punish a person or a group of people for a wrong. Imminent life must be in danger, and the intervention must be to protect innocent life. Tangential to the criteria of just cause is the criteria of right intention, which means that the motivations behind the intervention must also be just motivations. A third criteria is that of comparative justice. Now, in any conflict, there's a perceived right side and a perceived wrong side. So the criteria of comparative justice simply says that the injustice suffered by one party must significantly outweigh the injustice suffered by the other party. A fourth criteria is that of legitimate authority, and that is any war that is waged must be waged by a legitimate, recognized political entity. A fifth criteria is that of the probability of success, meaning that a just war has the likelihood of a positive outcome. The sixth criteria is that of last resort, meaning that any other attempts to resolve the conflict, peaceful attempts, negotiations, nonviolent resistance, must first be exhausted before war can be declared. And a final criteria is that of proportionality, and that is that the benefit from waging the war must equal or exceed the harm that will be caused in waging the war. So now let's look at the second component, and that is jus in bello, the right conduct within war. So there are three criteria typically that have to be met for the actual waging of a war to be considered just. First is that of distinction, meaning that there must be a distinction between combatants and non-combatants, and all attempts must be made to protect innocents from harm. This means that you don't want to bomb residential areas, you don't want to capture civilians. The targets need to be enemy combatant targets. So the second criteria is that of proportionality, and it simply states that a military attack cannot be undertaken with the knowledge that civilian injuries would be clearly excessive in relation to the military benefits. So the third criteria is that of military necessity, and it simply states that waging a just war should be governed by the principle of minimum force. So any attack or action must be aimed at the enemy and must at all costs try to avoid harming civilians or destroying civilian property, and that the force used must be proportional to the outcome of the military action. Now, the third component of just war theory is a relatively new component added in recent years. It's called jus post bellum, and this concerns justice after the war, which includes peace treaties, reconstruction, war crimes trials, and war reparations. So there are 5 criteria that have been discussed in contemporary literature. The first is that there needs to be a just cause for termination or for ending the war. So a state can terminate a war if there's been a reasonable vindication of the rights that were violated in the first place, and if the aggressor is willing to negotiate some term of surrender. Now, the terms of surrender can include a formal apology, compensation, war crimes trials, maybe even rehabilitation. A state can also end a war if it's clear that any just goals that were sought by means of war are clearly not going to be met. The second criteria is that of right intention. So a state must only terminate a war under the conditions agreed upon in the just cause for termination. Revenge, for example, is not permissible. The third one is public declaration and authority. So any terms of peace must be made by a legitimate authority and must be accepted by a legitimate authority. The fourth criteria is discrimination. So the victor, the winning state, is to differentiate between political and military leaders, combatants, and civilians, and that any punitive measures, any punishments, are to be directed only at those who are actively engaged in combat. And the fifth criteria is that of proportionality, meaning that any terms of surrender must be proportional to the aggression during the war or the harms that were caused. So again, this cannot be a means of exacting revenge or placing too harsh a punishment on those who are engaged in the war. So good luck in reading your chapter 15. I hope you enjoy this discussion of war, and we'll see you in chapter 16, where we will talk about terrorism.